Welcome to the 54th reading of my memoir, The Innocence of Guilt. Closing my heart to Dad. The field trips were enjoyable. The Tate Gallery, museums, other interesting London landmarks, and the different Bernardo homes we visited. I took pleasure in writing down observations in my diary. Once a few of us went on an unsupervised trip to Oxford Street. It had the reputation of having the longest span of fashion shops in London. We'd all received our first pay packet, 1 month's pay. Not a huge amount, but more money than I'd ever held in my hand, other than the insurance money I blew on a transistor radio 4 years previously. Strolling along the famous street, I glimpsed a beautiful rust-brown corduroy coat in a shop window. I called the girls over to see it. "Does it suit me? Do you think I should buy it?" "Go in and try it on. We'll wait outside." It took every penny I had, but I bought it because it was the most beautiful coat I'd ever seen. On our return to Queen Victoria House, it didn't take long for me to realize I'd spent all of my next month's living allowance. We didn't have to pay room and board or fees for the course, but there were expenses, money for field trips, supplies for crafts, as well as personal needs. I knew I wouldn't write home for money, out of pure pride. So I asked different girls if they would tide me over for the bus fares and other incidentals as they came up. They soon realized they would have to support me for the rest of the month, and one by one they turned me down. I panicked. I went to my closest friend, although I wished she didn't have to know, and poured out my turmoil to her. If she declined, I would be sent home in disgrace. Cheryl agreed to lend me every bit of money I needed until payday at the end of October, when we'd probably be going our separate ways and never see each other again. The other girls were furious at her for helping me, but she didn't let them influence her decision. Cheryl and I were natural romantics, reading poetry and fanciful prose. Any time we weren't in class, we could be found in each other's rooms, sharing our philosophies and dreams. We could converse without any embarrassment, and we were like sisters, more than sisters, because we'd chosen each other. A vacancy occurred at Collier House back in Colchester. It was offered to me, as each pupil completed the remaining months of the 14-month course in a practical setting. I wrote to Brian, still in Colchester, asking for his advice. I wanted to stay in London and work in the village home in one of the cottages, as Cheryl had decided to do, but didn't want to force Brian's hand. Still unsure that he deeply cared for me, I waited for him to make the next move. I sat down at my desk by the open window one afternoon and prayed. The sun shone, birds sang in the trees. One of those perfectly brilliant late September days, an Indian summer that takes away all thoughts of the impending winter. God's presence seemed to fill the room. I told him I belonged to him and desired with all my heart to live my life for him, even if it meant giving up Brian. No idea how I managed to say that and mean it, in order to serve him better. A peace settled on me after this prayer. In letters home, I shared how much I enjoyed my studies, how much I loved my new life. Despite some problems, it was true. I didn't regret my life change. I'd ran out of clothes by the end of the first month, so wrote home for a parcel to be sent. I received it a few days later, all neatly wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. A perfect work of art from my dad. According to Mum, Dad said that if I wanted anything, I was only to ask and he would give it to me. I didn't know how to react. I didn't want to ask him for anything ever again, and yet he'd wrapped up the parcel for me with such care. Mum would not have done it so nicely, and I'd accepted it. Would he have sent me money if he'd known how stupidly I spent my first pay packet? I didn't think so, but I hadn't given him the chance. If only he'd apologized for the cruel words he'd spoken before I left, I might have been able to keep the communication open. But I decided to play safe. I wrote newsy letters, but kept my heart closed towards him. Dad never wrote back. Mum's handwriting filled the pages of the letters I received, so I found it easy to dissociate my emotions from his. I received a letter from Brian in which he stated we would see more of each other if I stayed in London, although only 1 day a week, as he studied hard the rest of the time. He would go home to Colchester for 3 months in the summer, holding down his usual job at Pertwee's and to be with his parents, but we could have a holiday together. So in his view, he would love me to stay. He cautioned me not to make a hasty decision, though, but to talk it over with my parents. He asked me not to tell them he'd been giving me advice in any way, in case they thought he influenced my decision not to go home. As I read his letter, written with such careful consideration of my feelings and concern for my family, I couldn't help thinking how different our family situations were. How little he understood mine. I hadn't done a good job of standing on my own feet so far, but going back to Colchester would be running back in defeat. And what would I be going back to? Not a close, loving family, but more stress and strife. I made the decision to stay. After a week of settling in at college around the end of September, Brian ventured out on the tube to see me, and we were overjoyed at being together again. I introduced him to Cheryl and some of the girls who still befriended me, and they warmly welcomed him to join them in the common room. We started our Saturday dates, and during the week we wrote letters to each other, pouring out our thoughts and idealistic ideas for our futures, whatever they would be. He wrote that he loved me, but he hadn't yet told me to my face, so I still couldn't grasp that such a wondrous thing had, after all this time, happened to me. With a huge sigh of relief, I learnt I had passed the course, with a few reservations from the head tutor. I hadn't been a perfect student, but I still had practical work ahead of me to achieve, so she wished me the best. I went home for a week's leave before the final closure of things, and Brian joined me at the weekend. Once back in Queen Victoria House, safely hidden away, I was out of touch with what went on in the world outside. Brian, now back in London, wrote to share his concern over the Cuban Missile Crisis, his worry that the world could be close to destruction. When he wrote later to tell me it was over, all that time I hadn't had a clue that the world had stood on the brink of a nuclear war, with the Russians lining up missiles aimed at the entire Western Hemisphere. After saying goodbye to most of the other girls leaving to work at different Bernardo homes across the country, I packed up my belongings to go to Burwell Park, my assigned cottage. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to subscribe, like, or comment on this reading, and hopefully you will tune in to the next one. Bye for now.